Often in politically driven discussions of history, there will be a frequent equivalating of the Southern Confederacy, which seceded from the United States and fought the Union during the Civil War, to countries and regimes like Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. But are they similar? Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Now, before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has donated to us on Patreon and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Having dealt with demonetization and even censorship in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, support from our patrons and donors helps make regular videos possible. Every donation goes a long way to keeping our channel going, and as a show of thanks, if you donate to help support the channel, you'll gain access to some great perks, including physical merchandise, a custom-designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos, or just chat with me in the community directly. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the description or comment section to visit our Patreon page and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button next to the subscribe button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, please consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. Let's look at this matter from 4 different dimensions: government power or authority, social values, economic sensibilities, and drives. On matters of authority, Italy and Germany under the regimes of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler were dictatorships, authoritarian states under the guidance of a singular ruler serving indefinitely and with wide-reaching powers over the state. In their recent pasts, both countries had been monarchies, and Italy had even retained its king for the duration of Mussolini's regime. Both Italy and Germany had cultures rooted in hierarchical authority, and the rise of this new authoritarian rule within both countries could in part be attributed as a reaction to increasing democratization within both countries and the perceived weakening of monarchical power. A similar case can also be made of Spain, which itself saw the rise of an authoritarian regime in the wake of a democratizing of the monarchy. The Confederacy, in contrast, was a constitutional republic, modeled near identically to the United States, which it had broken away from, with a few exceptions which, rather than consolidate government power, decentralized the degree of federal authority to the state governments. Of course, the Confederate Constitution also enshrined protections for slavery as it stood within the Confederacy, but interestingly enough outlawed the further importation of slaves from Africa. The Confederate president could not serve indefinitely, but did have a slightly extended term of 6 years from the traditional 4 years, and could not be re-elected like the US president. Of course, politicians would be elected at the state and local level, and the Confederacy would have a Congress of People's Representatives who often clashed and debated, and which very interestingly eventually came to act as the dominant branch of government over the executive, despite the war provisions meant to give the Confederate president greater powers until the end of the Civil War. None of the trappings of dictatorship which characterized the regimes of Italy and Germany were present within the Confederacy. It was, in every reasonable sense of the words, a constitutional and democratic country. Further adding to this is the fact that the southern states, unlike Italy and Germany, did in fact have a strongly democratic culture derived from both Jeffersonian political thought and Baptist theological belief. It was these states which expanded the franchise from merely wealthy landowners to the free white male population regardless of wealth, despite the fact that land ownership was more widespread in the South and the ideologically opposed northern states had a much faster growing population. Meaning the South pursued this policy of democratization for the sake of democratization, even despite it being against their own interests. If the Confederacy had an ideology, it most certainly was not authoritarian, but democratic. Now, of course, is the matter of social values. Without question, Germany and Italy were very socially conservative, and in comparison to the Union, the Confederacy was in fact conservative as well. However, the conservatism of Italy and Germany is distinct from that of the Confederacy. For the Italians and Germans, their brand of conservatism was radical. It sought aggressive change to a system which they saw as descending further and further into social liberalism. For Italy and Germany, the establishment conservatism of monarchy, the king for Italy and the Kaiser for Germany, it wasn't enough to merely strengthen or revive these institutions. Something entirely new had to take their place, and the regimes which followed adopted highly radical ideologies, that is, ideologies which sought to shake up and challenge the status quo, not simply regress to the policies of a decade or two prior. For the Confederacy, however, they were not radical in the same sense of desiring change. The radical faction of their time was the newly formed Republican Party, which was dissatisfied with the conservative establishment perpetuated by the South, and which had been the dominant force within the country for decades by that point. The radicalism, the demand for change from the North, was seen as so frightening to the South, which mind you saw itself as the essential core of the United States, that it chose to break away to continue with its status quo. Both the Confederacy and the regimes of Europe were conservative, but while Germany and Italy were radically conservative by the very definition of the word, the conservatism of the Confederacy was much more establishment, traditional, nothing particularly bold or remarkable for the time in which it existed. Had the Confederacy remained independent, it wouldn't have been something radically new. It would have been as though the United States as it was from 1800 to 1860 simply continued into the future. Economically, and this harkens back to government authority, there is again a great contrast between the Confederates and the Germans and Italians. While in Germany and Italy there was a greater emphasis on commanding the economy and upon building a corporatist model in which there was a balance between labor, business, and government, the economy of the South was largely laissez-faire, though some have chalked this up to merely meaning oligarchic, with power having truly been in the hands of a select few wealthy farmers. But even still, the concentration of economic power in the South was far more decentralized than what would eventually emerge in the North during the Gilded Age, an age when the United States truly had something which could be called an oligarchy. The agricultural nature of the Southern economy had fostered strong support for free markets which allowed Southern crops to be exported far and wide at high return, as well as allow for the importation of foreign manufactured goods at cheap prices. In contrast, the industrial nature of Germany and Italy had led the countries to seek autarky and favor protectionism. Concepts like free trade were seen as parasitic and part of a scheme of global capitalism to enrich a select few international oligarchs at the expense of the nation-state. Economically speaking, there was little if any similarity between the Confederacy and the European Axis. Finally, drives. This brings us back to consider the conservative nature of the countries and what led them to emerge. The Confederates, as we said, viewed themselves as the true core of the United States and feared the policies of the radical Republicans, most particularly the policy of immediate abolition. Confederate secession was driven, as we said before, not by radicalism but by a fear of radicalism. It stemmed from a conservative desire to maintain the status quo against the tides of change, to preserve what they saw as a Southern way of life which was constitutional, in line with founding principles, and the traditional way by which the country had been governed for at least half a century. The South was essentially willing to surrender the Empire of America, the vastness of land which they had acquired, for the sake of preserving a Southern nation. In this way, the South is almost the inverse of Austria-Hungary, which refused to concentrate on its Catholic German national identity in an effort to retain its large and diverse empire which was pulling in several different directions. For the South to have seceded would have been like Austria granting independence to Hungary in the aftermath of the Austro-Prussian War, choosing to go it alone than to accept a reduction of their authority at the national level. Unlike the South, Germany and Italy held drives of irredentism. In their vision, they had nation-states, but those nation-states were incomplete, whether because a land was historically theirs or because an ethnic population of theirs was removed from the mainland, and thus demanded the reconquest and annexation of these lands which may very well have held non-German and non-Italian populations. While not necessarily imperialistic, irredentism can become imperialist and is certainly expansionist. It is not often done as a matter of survival, but to consolidate power, unless of course those displaced populations are facing persecution outside the nation's borders. To compare the secessionism of the Confederacy to German and Italian expansionism, once again the two very obviously contrast. So why do so many people conflate the Confederacy with the European Axis? What if anything do the two have in common? Plainly, both agitate modern sensibilities not for their distinct philosophies on authority or economics. What the vast majority of people take issue with in regard to these countries, and why they are so often paired together, is merely the idea that both were racist. To many in the modern day, the Confederacy represents for the United States this entity of oppression, a country whose sole purpose, we are to believe, was the perpetuation of slavery, that the Confederacy was just a purely evil thing devoid of redeemable qualities, just as the regimes of Italy and Germany had been for Europe. To this end, it has become commonplace for some to call the Confederacy Fascist, despite not being anything of the sort, for what seems to be nothing more than the conflating of the terms fascist and racist, racism being a terribly arbitrary standard by which to judge countries across history, as virtually all will fail to live up to the ever-liberalizing standards of the contemporary time, be they today or a century from now. With opposition to racism having become so central a facet of contemporary morality, it's understandable why many today, from academics to armchair historians, attempt to hold up those countries which, relative to their contemporaries, appeared more egalitarian, while demonizing those countries which appeared relatively more intolerant. But morality and standards have evolved a lot over time. They vary widely from country to continent, and it is fanciful and plainly dishonest to oversimplify the complexity of history in an effort to suit modern moral standards. But what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The US of Z thanks for watching. Mr. Z, out.